Welcome to Let There Be Rock, Episode 4, The British Invasion. While rock and roll has its origins as a uniquely American cultural phenomenon, it's going to invade into the European continent, particularly into England. And England's going to adopt this American sound. They're going to blend the sounds of rock and roll, fusion, soul, skiffle, and R&B. And they're going to come up with a new style of music all their own. It's going to be called beat music, or more often, just the Mersey Beat. The River Mersey ran right along Liverpool, and Liverpool is going to be the heart of the Mersey Beat. It's where bands like Gerry and the Pacemakers and the Beatles are from. While the Beatles are the band that we most associate with the Mersey Beat, Gerry and the Pacemakers got there first. Gerry and the Pacemakers had a very clean, crisp sound, lots of harmonies, very reminiscent of the R&B and soul music. You can hear the influences of things like Motown in their music. This is Don't Let the Sun Catch You Crying by Gerry and the Pacemakers.
Don't let the sun catch you crying.
Hear that almost a southern sound in there.
The night's the time for all your tears.
That simple drum comes right out of skiffle.
Your heart may be broken tonight, but tomorrow in the morning light, don't let the sun catch you crying.
The Beatles are probably the biggest rock and roll band in all of history. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. These four men, barely out of their teens, in fact George was still 17, went to Hamburg, Germany and worked inside the bars where they worked their craft off. They're American-style rock and roll. However, it had changed quite a bit. By the time they came back to England, we started hearing about a new style of music, this Mersey Beat. The Beatles were something different. When the Beatles invaded America, they were the biggest band the world had ever seen. With these crazy mop-top haircuts they had, parents didn't really know what to think about them. And at first, the Beatles seemed kind of safe. They looked like clean-cut kids, and their music was really kind of lollipop rock. This is an early version of the Beatles. They're going to change a lot over time. This is She Loves You by the Beatles, again remastered in 2009. Live recording. George Martin as a producer could do no wrong. You can feel the Motown sound in here. One of the biggest hits for the Beatles was a ballad written by 14-year-old Paul McCartney. When he was 14, the song was simply called Scrambled Eggs. Later on, he's going to add some more interesting lyrics. And Scrambled Eggs becomes the classic Yesterday. This is the 2009 remastered version of Yesterday by the Beatles. Love that opening. Voice is so clean. This band could do anything. The orchestration in the background, very powerful. If you're a music fan, you probably have a favorite Beatles. whether it be the innocent mop-top Beatles of She Loves You or the long-haired hippie Beatles of Let It Be. But there's one that's always super controversial. Right in the middle there, while the Beatles were experimenting with, with drugs for a while, they released an album called Magical Mystery Tour. And it was an album that was very artsy. It was a little different. People didn't know what to do. There were songs like Revolution Number 9, where John Lennon just kept repeating the word number 9 over and over again. And then there was the famous song I Am the Walrus. This is I Am the Walrus, remastered in 2009. If you've got headphones on, you'll hear it going back and forth. Lots of motion, beautiful orchestrations. Don't try and make sense out of the lyrics. This is John Lennon's lyrics. And at least according to John, it's intentionally nonsense. Love that voice. In the late 60s, the Beatles reinvented themselves again. No longer the suit-wearing mop tops, clean-cut gentlemen. They were long-haired hippies. George Harrison had gone off and experimented a little bit with Hinduism, and they'd all experimented a little bit with drugs, and they were not getting along as well as they used to. These men are now approaching 30. It's 1969, and they were going to put a new album out. The album was supposed to be called We Can Work It Out, and it was supposed to launch the next level of their career. But instead, the Beatles broke up. Paul McCartney left the band. John Lennon and Paul are going to each have their own solo careers, George Harrison as well for a while. And instead, the title track to We Can Work It Out was changed to Let It Be. This is Let It Be remastered, the Beatles. It's Paul McCartney playing the piano. You could hear some gospel in here. Absolutely gorgeous. It's the simplicity of Paul McCartney's writing. And then you have these harmonies. I'm going to let you listen for a little while, but listen for the build-up to the crescendo, when this song really becomes rock and roll. I know I might not look like it now, but I grew up a fan of punk rock and hard rock. I love that hard guitar driving sound of that genre of music. And my friends and I used to sit around and argue about who the godfathers were of heavy metal, or the godfathers of hard rock. And you always heard names like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. But a name that you didn't hear a lot was the Beatles. And there's an argument that the very first hard rock song was the Beatles. Paul McCartney had heard about a song that The Who had written and was told that it was the hardest thing he would ever hear. And Paul McCartney was determined that The Who was not going to have that record. So he went back and he wrote a song about a playground slide. It's called Helter Skelter. It's been covered by many, many people. One of the most famous is Motley Crue in 1981. But this is the original version with Paul McCartney, that beautiful crisp voice that sang Yesterday, howling hard rock. Helter Skelter's remastered 2009 edition. Love it. Hear that blues shouting quality. The emotion, shouting on key. Amazing. After the Beatles broke up in 1969, all 4 of the original members were never in the same room again. There was a bit of a feud, although it seemed to be fairly friendly. They each kept in touch with each other separately, but they went out of their way to say that there's not going to be a rejoining of the band. Each of the members went their own way, and they sometimes shot pot shots at each other. The 2 most famous, the most prolific writers of the Beatles were John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And John Lennon fired a shot across Paul McCartney's proverbial bow with his song, How Do You Sleep? According to legend at least, this song was aimed at Paul McCartney for just wanting to write silly love songs all the time instead of dealing with serious political issues. John Lennon had become a political monster by this point, and this was kind of his way of exorcising those demons. So let's listen to the John Lennon solo song, How Do You Sleep? This was remastered in 2010. Typical John Lennon opening, kind of chaotic. Sgt. Pepper was their biggest album. Always loved the whine in John Lennon's voice. That's harkening back to the Paul is Dead hoax. Still got those orchestrations. Beautiful. Paul McCartney had his own super successful career with his new band Wings. And in 1976, he's going to respond to John Lennon's How Do You Sleep with his own song. Remember, How Do You Sleep was all about John Lennon saying, Paul McCartney is just writing these sappy love ballads, and there's more important things. Well, Paul McCartney is going to respond on the album Give My Regards to Broad Street with the song Silly Love Songs. 1976, Paul McCartney. What a great opening. Very industrial. Listen for the harmonies. Try to ignore Linda McCartney in the background. She didn't sing that well. Bass. Some people want to fill the world with silly love songs. What's wrong with that? What a great response to How Do You Sleep? And then we're going to get the crescendo. Listen to those horns. Paul McCartney was a genius. Well, thank you for this little voyage through the Mersey Beat. This was part one of the British invasion, dealing with the two big bands from Liverpool, Gerry and the Pacemakers, and a lot on the Beatles. There's a good chance that this is going to be blocked. The Beatles are notorious blockers. I sincerely hope they aren't. But there's a real good possibility. Y'all stay tuned for part two, where we're going to deal with bands like the Rolling Stones and the Who.